Humanity finally said enough. The galaxy realized the war had begun. The message came in at 3:40 station. Time. I was still holding a cold cup of coffee when my tablet lit up in a single military cipher code filled the screen. I had seen diplomatic codes every day. For 11 years, I had never seen a military cipher. Not once. Not addressed to me. My name is Yara Solis. I am, or I was, a level 4 human. Diplomatic attaché stationed aboard Axis 7, the Galactic Conclave's neutral arbitration platform. My job, the job I had done quietly in, obediently for over a decade, was to sit in rooms full of beings who did not respect my species and smile and argue in carefully measured tones and accept whatever the conclave decided, and then go back to my quarters and write reports that nobody read. I was good at it. I was very good at it. And I had spent 11 years being good at it while New Carthage burned. Not all at once. That is the thing people outside the diplomatic world do not understand. New Carthage did not burn in a single dramatic moment. It burned slowly. It burned through a dozen small decisions, ignored complaints, postponed hearings, and polite refusals to act. The Vreth Dominion had been pressing at the colony's borders for 6 years. 6 years of escalating incidents. 6 years of my reports. 6 years of the conclave scheduling review sessions 14 months into the future, and then rescheduling them again. And then 22 days ago, the Vreth fired. They did not warn the colony. They did not issue an ultimatum. The planetary defense grid went offline. First, we still do not know exactly how. And then the orbital strikes began. It lasted 4 hours. When it was over, New Carthage was a colony of ash and silence, and 2,300,000 human beings were gone. I sat in the mediation chamber the next morning and listened to 3 Vreth ambassadors describe it as a corrective administrative action regarding a disputed territorial boundary. One of them used the phrase regrettable, but necessary. He said it with the tone of someone who had just had to cancel a lunch reservation. I wrote it down. I write everything down. Around me, the other galactic delegations sat with their usual careful neutrality. The Torvin T, elder near the back wall, examined something on his personal screen throughout the entire presentation. The 2 Kel Shirati observers spoke quietly to each other and did not look at the main display at all, which showed in detailed satellite imagery what had been done to New Carthage. A conclave moderator announced that an official hearing had been scheduled 8 months from now. I wrote that down too. After the session, I went to the small human staff room at the far end of Corridor 9. It smelled like recycled air and instant soup. Leon Carter, our junior communications officer, was already there. He was 26 years old. He had a photograph of his younger sister pinned to the wall beside his workstation. She had lived on New Carthage. He did not say anything when I came in. Neither did I. There was nothing left that fit inside language. I spent the rest of that day and the following 3 weeks doing what I always did: filing, responding, attending sessions, nodding carefully. Our senior attaché, a quiet, methodical man named Oliver Hale, drafted a formal objection on behalf of the human delegation. It was 7 pages long and very precisely worded. The conclave received it with acknowledgement, which meant they put it in a queue. And then the cipher arrived. I read it 4 times in my quarters, standing up because I had forgotten to sit down. The cipher resolved to 12 words in standard English. That was all. 12 words and an authentication code that matched the direct seal of Earth's Admiralty Council. Withdraw from conclave proceedings. Immediately. Authorization to speak has been revoked. No explanation. No further instruction. Just those words and a second line. Beneath them, that was not an order at all. It was a statement. 1 word. Enough. I stood there for a long time. Outside the small viewport above my desk, Axis 7's navigation lights blinked, their slow, regular rhythm against the dark. Somewhere in the station's lower levels, the VREF delegation would be preparing for tomorrow's session, in which they planned to formally request that the disputed border region be redrawn. Their favor. I had already read the draft proposal. It was 40 pages long and very confident. I thought about New Carthage. I thought about the satellite images I had been required to review as part of the formal record. I thought about Leon Carter's photograph and the way he had not said anything when I came into the room because there was nothing to say. Then I picked up my tablet and walked to the mediation chamber. The morning session had already begun. Ambassador Vref Kalin was midway through a point about navigational jurisdiction. When I walked through the main doors, every head in the room turned. Diplomats do not interrupt sessions. It is simply not done. I had never done it once in 11 years. I walked to the human delegation table, picked up the official address, microphone, and waited. Ambassador Vref Kalin stopped speaking. The conclave moderator looked at me with visible confusion. Attaché Solis, the moderator, said, "You are not listed as primary speaker for this session." "I am aware," I said. My voice was completely steady. I was faintly surprised by that. I read the Admiralty's withdrawal notice into the official record. All 12 words. I identified the authentication code. I stated, in formal conclave language, that the human delegation was withdrawing from all active and pending proceedings effective immediately and would not be participating in the scheduled hearing or any further session under current conclave authority. The chamber was absolutely quiet. Ambassador Vref Kalin recovered first. He was a large being, impressively composed, and he had spent years perfecting an expression of patient condescension whenever humans were involved. He wore it now. The human delegation does not have the standing to make such a declaration. Outside of, "I did not ask for your legal opinion," I said. I said it quietly. I did not raise my voice. I do not think I have ever spoken those words to a Vreth ambassador before, or to any ambassador. It felt strange. It felt, in a way I had not expected, like breathing properly for the first time in a very long while. I set the microphone down and walked out. Leon was waiting in the corridor. He had heard through the room's external audio feed. He looked at me the way people look when they're not sure whether to be frightened or something else. "What happens now?" he asked. I did not have an answer. I had 12 words from the Admiralty and the knowledge that every human diplomatic staff member on Axis 7 had just received the same recall order I had. I knew that the conclave would convene. An emergency procedural session within hours. I knew that the Vreth delegation would file a formal protest by afternoon. I knew that Oliver Hale was already in his quarters preparing a briefing for Earth on the diplomatic fallout. What I did not know, what none of us in the diplomatic world knew, was what was happening on the other side of the communication wall. What the military cipher had not said. What the Admiralty's single word actually meant in terms of ships and coordinates, and decisions already made in rooms we had never been invited into. I found out later, like everyone else, when the conclave's tracking network lit up with about 4,000 simultaneous contact losses. Every human vessel registered with the Galactic Navigation System had gone dark at exactly the same moment across 17 star systems, as if they had simply ceased to exist. The Torati elder sent me a private message that evening. It said they do not understand what they have done. I read it once. I thought about his tone during the session, the way he had looked at his screen, instead of at the images of New Carthage. I wrote 3 words back: yes, we do. Then I closed the channel, sat on the edge of my bunk in the small human staff quarters on Corridor 9, and for the first time in 11 years, I did not write a report. There was no point. The conclave was no longer our audience. Somewhere out in the dark beyond Axis 7's lights, humanity had stopped filing complaints. The Kepler exclusion zone had been closed to galactic traffic for 71 years. The official reason, listed in every conclave navigation database, was gravitational instability in the outer system lanes. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. It was also completely untrue. I am Admiral Davian, and I have commanded this sector for 9 of those 71 years. Before me, Admiral Claire Weston held it for 12. Before her, a man named Henry Park held it for 15, and never once permitted conclave observation vessel to enter. Despite 4 formal requests, a diplomatic incident, and 1 very persistent Torati survey ship that got within 2 light hours of the outer perimeter before our pickets redirected it with some creative navigation interference and an apologetic message about sensor maintenance. What the Kepler exclusion zone actually contained was the largest construction project in human history. Not large by galactic standards. At least not yet. The Torati had shipyards that stretched across entire asteroid belts. The Vreth Dominion maintained a standing fleet that numbered in the tens of thousands. On raw numbers, humanity was outmatched. By any serious measure, we had always been outmatched on raw numbers. We had spent 71 years making sure that would not matter. I was standing on the bridge of the carrier vessel Unbroken Shore when Yara's withdrawal confirmation reached us. My communications officer, a composed young woman named Harriet Cole, handed me the authenticated receipt without a word. She had been briefed. My entire senior staff had been briefed. We had been waiting for this message for 8 days, and for the possibility of this message for considerably longer. I read it, set it on the console, looked out at the viewport from the bridge of the Unbroken Shore. The view was not what you see in the illustrated histories. There are no dramatic silhouettes against stars, no gleaming rows of ships arranged like a painting. What you actually see is structure, scaffolding and gantries and work. Platforms extending across 300 km, lit from within by the running lights of 1,000 smaller vessels moving between hulls in various stages of completion. The shapes are not elegant. They were not built to be elegant. I am going to try to explain something that took me years to understand and that I think most other species in this galaxy never understood at all. About humanity. Other civilizations, when they build warships, think about power projection. How far can this weapon reach? How impressive does it look at a diplomatic summit? How quickly can it end a fight? Humans do not think that way. We have had 10,000 years of fighting each other to think in, and what we learned, the hard lesson buried underneath all the history, is that wars are not usually ended by power. They are ended by endurance. The Vree Dominion built ships like precision instruments, beautiful, fast, and effective in the kind of short, decisive engagement where both sides agree, more or less, on the rules. Their fleet doctrine assumed that the losing side would recognize when it had lost and seek terms. They had fought that kind of war many times. They were very good at it. We did not build precision instruments. Every ship in the exclusion zone was designed to absorb punishment and continue functioning. Redundant power cores, distributed command nodes so that losing the bridge did not end the ship's ability to fight. Hull plating layered in ways that Vree metallurgists would have found inefficient because efficiency was not the point. The point was that if you hit one of our ships repeatedly and it did not stop coming and you had already spent your best weapons trying to stop it, then you had a problem that your doctrine had not prepared you for. We also built for numbers. Not Vree numbers. Not Tirathi numbers. Our own numbers. The number that, when combined with our other choices, would create a situation that no other species in the current galactic order had faced in recorded history. 4,218 active combat vessels, not counting support and logistics, not counting the patrol wings and the picket lines, not counting the independent strike packages that had been pre-positioned over the past 3 years in locations throughout Vree space that their own border sensors had not flagged because the positioning had been done very carefully and very slowly. I want to be clear about something. This was not an overnight decision. It was not made in anger after New Carthage, although New Carthage was the reason we finally moved. The decision to build this, to prepare this, had been made 30 years ago by people who looked at humanity's position in the galactic order and asked a simple question: if we remain exactly as we are, growing exactly as slowly as the conclave permits, what happens to us in 50 years? In 100? The answer was not comfortable. So we built. I took a walk through the lower decks of the unbroken shore about an hour after the withdrawal confirmation arrived. I do this when I am thinking. The ship was large enough that a walk through the lower decks was a genuine walk, 20 minutes at a steady pace to cross the secondary hull. I passed engineering teams running final checks on the drive systems. I passed weapons crew running calibrations. I passed a group of maintenance technicians who were sitting on equipment crates eating lunch and talking about something that made one of them laugh loudly enough that it echoed. I stopped. I watched them for a moment. They did not see me at first. This is what we were. Ordinary people eating lunch, laughing at something and also, simultaneously, the edge of something the galaxy was about to discover it had badly underestimated. When I got back to the bridge, Harriet had an intercept queued for me. Conclave communication channels flagged by our monitoring network. 2 items. First, a Vreth ambassador's internal message to his home government, describing the human withdrawal as an agitated reaction and predicting that we would request readmission within 90 days. Second, a Torati intelligence summary, discussing the human fleet withdrawal from tracking networks and concluding with what I can only describe as impressive confidence that we had recalled our vessels for defensive repositioning. Defensive. They still thought we were positioning defensively. I sat down in the command chair. Harriet was watching me. Most of my bridge staff were watching me the way people watch a commanding officer when they know a significant order is coming and they want to be paying full attention when it does. I thought about New Carthage. I thought about Yorisalis, whom I had met once 8 years ago at a personnel transition briefing. A small, precise woman who took notes constantly. I thought about what it must have cost her 11 years of absorbing insults on behalf of her species to walk into the chamber and set down the microphone. I thought about the 4,000 ships waiting in the dark around me. All hands, I said. General quarters. We are done waiting. The alert tone sounded through the ship. 90 seconds later, across 300 km of shipyards and staging areas, 4,000 vessels went to active status. Navigation seals disengaged. Drive cores came to full power. Weapon systems initialized. The first strike package had been given its coordinates 3 days ago. The pilots knew their objectives. They had trained for this. The planning had been meticulous and the intelligence had been gathered over years. There was nothing rushed about it. But something changes when the waiting is finally over. I felt it on the bridge, not excitement, not anger, something quieter and more serious than either. The feeling of a door closing behind you. First package, I said to the navigation coordinator, a commoner named Owen Price, who had been with me for 6 years. Execute on your mark. Owen did not hesitate. Executing. The first strike package entered real space 37 minutes later. They received no warning. Not because we lacked the ability to send one. Because New Carthage had received no warning. We remembered everything. That was the part the galaxy kept forgetting. On Axis 7, the Conclave's long-range tracking network showed 4,000 human contacts reappear simultaneously, moving with absolute purpose in 12 different directions at once. I was told later that the Conclave moderator who first read the sensor report asked 3 times to have it confirmed before she believed the numbers. By the time she confirmed them, the first engagements were already over. The Vreth border station at Reach Point 7 had assumed the dark shapes on its approach sensors were navigational echoes. It was a reasonable assumption. They had never seen a human warship before. They had never needed to think about what it would mean if they did. Owen's voice was quiet beside me. Reach Point 7 is down, Admiral. Log it, I said. He did. That was how it began. Not with a speech or a manifesto. Not with a declaration sent to the conclave or a final ultimatum to the Vreth. Just 4,000 ships in motion and one station going dark, and the long, patient wait of a species that had been told to wait and file complaints finally moving in a different direction. My name is Priya Adami, and I was the first human being to set foot on a Vreth military installation. I want to be clear that this was not planned as a historic moment. Sergeant Kira Webb was supposed to go first, but she had a loose boot seal. That took 4 extra seconds to check, and I was already through the breach when she finished. So it was me. I found out it was historic 3 weeks later when somebody put a picture of my back mid-crouch in a corridor aboard Reach Station 11 on the front cover of a news aggregate. I look small in the photograph. The corridor behind me is large and empty and very alien, and my rifle is up and my head is turned slightly to the right, where I heard a sound that turned out to be a pressure valve releasing steam. I was 29 years old. I had been in the Mobile Strike Corps for 5 years. I had trained for boarding actions in simulated environments that were, as it turned out, reasonably accurate to the real thing, except that the real thing smells different. Vreth installations have a particular smell, something dry and faintly electrical, like the air just before a lightning strike. I noticed it the moment we breached. I still notice it now, months later, every time I try to sleep. Reach Station 11 was our third boarding action. The first 2 had been fast, decisive, and almost completely without resistance, because the Vreth crews on the outer border stations had not believed, even when our ships appeared on their sensors, that humans were actually coming for them. By the time the belief arrived, we were already aboard. The third was different. The station commander at 11 had a name that translated roughly as commander of the Outer Reach 3rd Division, which was more of a title than a name, so we called him Commander Pale because of the particular color his skin went when he was angry, which was most of the time we were dealing with him. He had managed to get a warning out before we breached. He had 52 soldiers ready when we came through. I am going to say something here that might be difficult to explain if you have not spent time in an active combat environment. Fighting is not what you expect it to be, even when you have trained for it. The sounds are wrong. The time feels wrong. Everything happens faster and slower simultaneously, and you spend a significant portion of it doing very ordinary things, moving around a corner, checking a sight line, communicating with the person beside you in short, clipped words while your body runs on. Something that is not quite fear and not quite focus, but is both at once very loudly. What surprised the Vreth soldiers about us was not our weapons. Their weapons were comparable in most respects and superior in a few. What surprised them was that we did not stop. Vreth military doctrine, we learned later from the intelligence briefings, was built around a concept of engagement thresholds. There was a level of damage and loss at which a unit was expected to withdraw or surrender. It was not considered weakness. It was considered rational. The Vreth had fought many wars against many species, and the doctrine had served them very well because most species shared a similar intuition. At some point, continuing is not worth what it costs. We did not stop. Not because we were not being hurt. Corporal Nathan Finch took a hit to his left shoulder in the second corridor and kept moving. Sergeant Webb had her helmet cracked. The fourth section and kept moving. We stopped when we reached an objective, and when we were told to stop and not before. I think the Vreth soldiers at Reach Station 11 genuinely did not understand what they were watching. I could see it on the faces of the ones we got close enough to see, a kind of baffled recalculation, like they were looking at a math problem that refused to resolve. They had heard us. Why were we still advancing? We are the species that climbed out of an ice age with tools made of rocks and bones. We ran after animals for days until the animals died of exhaustion. We crossed oceans on wooden platforms with no idea what was on the other side. We do not have a threshold in the way. The Vreth meant it. We have a direction and we move in it until we are told otherwise or until there is nothing left to move toward. Commander Pale surrendered Reach Station 11 4 hours and 17 minutes after we breached. He was brought to our forward command post, a cleared storage bay with a folding table and 2 portable lights, and he stood there in front of Lieutenant Commander Owen Barker, who was our senior officer on the boarding team, and he said through the translation unit, "Name your terms." Owen looked at him for a moment. Owen is a very quiet person, which people sometimes mistake for uncertainty. It is not uncertainty. He said, "We do not have terms. That is a conversation between governments. Right now, I need you to order your remaining crew to stand down and follow our instructions." Commander Pale said, "I am asking what humanity wants. What will make this stop?" Owen said, "New Carthage." The commander processed this. New Carthage cannot be returned. It no longer exists as it was. "I know," Owen said. "That is why we are still here." He said it without raising his voice, without any visible emotion at all. And I think that quiet, factual delivery was what disturbed Commander Pale most. He had been prepared for anger. Anger he could have categorized. The patient, simple logic of what Owen was saying, "We are here because of what you did, and we will continue to be here until that is addressed, and no temporary solution will change that," was harder to process. We secured 11 Vreth border stations in the first 3 weeks. Our losses were real. I am not going to pretend otherwise. Nathan Finch lost the use of his shoulder for 6 weeks. 2 people on a different team did not come back from Station 8, and their names are on a list that is growing and that we think about. War is not clean, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or has never been near one. But the Vreth losses were heavier, and more importantly, the Vreth did not know how to respond to what they were seeing. Their command structure was built for an enemy that followed predictable patterns. We did not follow predictable patterns. We did not fight the way the simulation said we would fight. We were everywhere at once on 12 fronts simultaneously, and we were faster on logistics than they had anticipated, and we kept coming. 3 weeks in, I was sitting in the cleared cargo bay that served as our team's rest area on Station 11, eating a ration that tasted like salted cardboard, when a notification came through on the shared command feed. I read it twice. The Vreth Dominion had formally requested conclave arbitration. I looked up. Nathan was sitting across from me, arm in a temporary brace, doing something with a small mechanical puzzle he carried everywhere. He looked at the notification on his own tablet. Then he looked at me. Arbitration, he said. I said. We looked at each other for a moment. Then I read the second part of the notification. Earth's automated diplomatic response had already gone out. It was 12 words in galactic standard. I will write them here exactly as they appeared on the feed. The human delegation has withdrawn from conclave proceedings. We wish you good luck. Nathan put down his puzzle. He stared at the tablet for a long moment. Then very quietly he laughed. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just a quiet exhale of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally been permitted to let it go. I ate the rest of my ration. It still tasted like salted cardboard. Outside the station's reinforced walls, the war was continuing in 11 other places simultaneously. Tomorrow we would move to our next objective. Commander Pale was in secured quarters, 3 corridors away, no doubt writing a very detailed report for his government. And somewhere in the ruins of New Carthage, 2,300,000 names waited for something they could no longer ask for themselves. We were still moving. We would keep moving. That was the only answer we had, and as it turned out, it was the only answer that mattered. They sent 4 delegations in 10 days. I want you to understand what that means. For 11 years, I sat in conclave chambers and waited months for other species to acknowledge that humanity had a valid concern. For 11 years, I submitted documentation and filed requests and accepted delays with careful professional patience. For 11 years, a dozen civilizations treated the human delegation as a procedural inconvenience. And then in 10 days, 4 of them came to us. My name is Yaroslav Alice, and I am now Earth's War Liaison. It is a title that did not exist 6 weeks ago because we had never needed one. A diplomat manages relationships. A war liaison manages the conversations that happen when those relationships have been suspended, when something larger and more serious is in motion and the other parties have realized quite suddenly that they need to be part of it. The first delegation was the Morath Collective. They arrived at the temporary human diplomatic facility on Axis 7, which we now operated, having formerly occupied the station's administrative wing after our withdrawal with 11 representatives and a great deal of carefully restrained urgency. The Morath had not spoken to a human diplomat in 4 years. Their previous position was that humanity's provisional membership in the conclave was administratively redundant. Given our limited galactic footprint, I had that phrase memorized. I had read it in a report and written it in my own file and thought about it on difficult evenings. Their lead representative was a precise, elderly being named Oritzen, and he sat across from me at the folding table, what used to be a conclave secondary conference room, and said that the Morath Collective was deeply concerned about the current instability in the border regions and wished to discuss frameworks for de-escalation. I looked at him for a moment. I had my notes in front of me. I had prepared for this meeting. I said, "Are you familiar with New Carthage?" He said, "Of course. The incident is a matter of formal conclave record. 2,300,000. People, I said. Their names are in our archive. We have all of them. We have been keeping records of every human lost in galactic border incidents for 40 years. Not just New Carthage. All of them. Oritson was quiet. I continued. The Morith Collective has been positioned adjacent to Vreth-controlled space for approximately 30 years. During that time, you have had 16 official exchanges with the Vreth government and have maintained what your diplomatic archive describes as a productive non-interference relationship. He started to say something. I continued. I am not accusing you of anything. I am giving you context. When we decide how to respond to your request today, the context will matter. Everything is in the record. It always has been. We simply never before had a reason to make the record relevant. There was a long silence. What does humanity want? He asked. It was becoming a familiar question. Right now, we want the Vreth to answer for New Carthage. That is the specific and immediate thing. What we want in general, what we will want once this immediate situation is resolved, is a galactic framework with teeth, real consequences, not a conclave that schedules hearings 8 months after 2 million people are gone. Something with actual enforcement. That is a significant structural change, Oritson said carefully. Yes, I said. It is. The second delegation was the Parath Federation, a mid-sized civilization on humanity's galactic spinward side. They were more direct. Their representative, a young diplomat named Fereth Cell, arrived with a single assistant and almost no ceremony, sat down and said, "We want to know if humanity intends to establish dominance over the current Vreth territories once the conflict is concluded." I appreciated the directness. I gave her a direct answer. No, I said. We have no interest in territory. We have no interest in an empire. We have very significant interest in accountability and in building something better than what currently exists. If the Parath Federation shares that interest, the conversation could be valuable. She studied me. What you are doing right now is rewriting the galactic order. What the galactic order was doing, I said, was permitting 2,300,000 human deaths without consequence. We are done permitting that. Fereth Cell was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my government would like to discuss a formal alignment. I look forward to it, I said. The third and fourth delegations were smaller and more cautious, testing the edges of what humanity was willing to discuss, looking for signs that we intended to replace the conclave's power structure with our own. I said the same things to each of them. We wanted accountability and structure, not territory or control. I meant it. Earth's council had been very clear. We were not fighting to build an empire. We had not spent 70 years in the exclusion zone to become the next Vreth Dominion. But the meeting that mattered most, the one I think about now when I consider how the period actually changed things, was not with any delegation. It was with a private communication I received on day 9. The Kelshir, by almost any metric, one of the most reclusive civilizations in the current galactic community. They have no standing presence in the conclave. They maintain no diplomatic missions. They participate in exactly enough galactic commerce to sustain themselves, and precisely no more. Most species treat them as a background. Fact present, quiet, irrelevant. 22 years ago, before I was a diplomat, before I had any knowledge of galactic politics, a Kelsier colony in the outer reaches experienced a severe agricultural failure due to mutation in their primary food crop. The colony was isolated enough that conclave relief mechanisms would have taken 2 years to mobilize a human cargo vessel on a long-haul route. Captain named Douglas Webb, no relation to any of the soldiers in this story as far as I know, received the distress signal and rerouted. He contacted 3 other human vessels in the region. Between the 4 ships, they delivered enough food and seed stock to keep the colony alive. They did it because there was a problem, and they were nearby and they could. There was no formal record, no conclave documentation. The Kelshirati sent private acknowledgement to the 4 vessels, and that was the end of it as far as the galactic record was concerned. On day 9 of the delegation period, I received a private channel communication from a Kelshirati source that I had no record of and could not trace. It was short. It said, "Debts older than your current grievance. Coordinates to follow." 48 hours later, 37 Kelshirati vessels appeared in the operational zone, adjacent to the VREF central systems. They did not announce themselves through conclave channels. They contacted Admiral Osei directly and said they were there. That was it. That was the entire communication. 37 ships, no explanation needed beyond the one already given. I stood in the temporary command room and read Davian's relay of the contact, and I did not have a word for what I felt. Not pride exactly, not relief. Something more like recognition. The understanding that the record we had been keeping, not just our diplomatic record, not just our military record, but the entire accumulated record of every human interaction with every being we had ever encountered was not just documentation. It was a kind of relationship, a very long, very patient relationship that other species had not noticed because they were not looking for it. We helped the Kelshirati colony because a captain named Douglas Webb saw a distress signal and thought, "We can do something about this." There was no calculation, no political consideration. He did it because it needed doing. And 22 years later, 37 ships appeared in a conflict zone because the Kelshirati remembered. The conclave emergency session that week was something I watched from a monitor in the command room because I was no longer permitted inside the chamber as a participant. A conclave elder named Verid Sol, who had been one of the most senior figures in galactic diplomacy for over 60 years, addressed the session and said that humanity's actions represented a fundamental threat to the stability of the galactic order. I wrote down the quote, "Old habit." Then I thought about the quote for a while. What Verid Sol meant was that the conclave's authority rested on the assumption that its decisions, however slow and however flawed, were the only available mechanism for resolving conflict, that there was no alternative, that all parties, however frustrated, would ultimately return to the table and accept whatever was offered because the table was the only option. We had left the table. We had built a different table, and now other species were asking to sit at ours. The Vreth sent another peace proposal on day 11, of the delegation period. It was more serious than the previous. 1. It acknowledged the loss of New Carthage, explicitly offered a formal statement of responsibility, and proposed a reparations framework that included financial compensation to human families affected by the event. I read it carefully. I took notes. Then I sent it to Earth's Council with my recommendation. My recommendation was continue. Not because the offer was meaningless. It was not meaningless. It was, compared to anything the Vreth had offered before, significant. But it stopped short of the one thing we had asked for clearly and repeatedly. It did not commit to the reconstruction. It did not commit to the names. It offered money, which is not the same as acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is not the same as making something right. I wrote in my recommendation, the Vreth proposal represents progress and should be noted in the record. It does not represent resolution. Resolution requires that the Vreth address New Carthage not as an administrative incident, but as what it was. Until that commitment exists, the current situation should continue. Earth's Council agreed. The conclave elder Vered Saul sent me a second private message 2 days after that. He was less measured this time. He said that I was being used by military interests to justify continued conflict. He said that no diplomatic resolution could fully satisfy the stated terms. He said that the human position was unreasonable. I wrote a response. I kept it short. I said the conclave scheduled a hearing for 8 months after New Carthage. I attended 30 sessions in 3 weeks trying to raise the priority. I filed 17 formal requests. I submitted 400 pages of supporting documentation. What I received was patience and advice to continue being patient. You are now telling me that our terms are unreasonable. I want you to understand that I have written all of this down. Every conversation, every delay, every suggestion that we should accept less than what happened to us and be grateful for the consideration. It is all in the record. It will remain in the record. He did not respond. On day 17, I received confirmation that the Vreth homeworld's outer orbital defense grid had gone offline. Not from our forces, from within. A client species the Vreth had controlled for generations, a quiet, careful people called the Arish who had been maintaining Vreth infrastructure for 40 years and who, it turned out, had been watching events unfold with a great deal of attention, had simply stopped doing their jobs and then had done certain other things to the systems they knew better than anyone. The Arish sent a brief communication to the Human Command Network. They said they had been waiting for the right moment. They said they hoped we understood. We did. The war was not over. But the question was no longer whether it would end in our favor. The question was what the terms would look like and how long it would take the Vreth government to arrive at the same understanding. In my temporary office on Axis 7, I updated the record. I noted the Arish action. I noted the current diplomatic positions of each of the 4 delegations we had received. I noted the Kel Shirati presence in the operational zone. Then I made a note I had never made in 11 years of diplomatic service. Not about a complaint or a procedural objection or a delayed hearing. Just a simple factual entry about what was happening and what it meant. Galactic order in restructuring phase. Humanity operating as primary. Coordinating authority for proposed new framework. Negotiations ongoing. The record continues. I put the tablet down. Through the viewport of the office that used to belong to Conclave. Administrator, the stars were exactly the same as they always were. Indifferent. Enormous. Patient in a way that made human patience seem brief. But we were still here. And we were still moving. And the record continued. The armistice was signed on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I had written it in my log that morning, not the date, just the day, the way I write. Every morning, the way I have written. Every morning since I was assigned to Axis 7 11 years ago. Old habits are hard to end, even when everything else has changed. My name is Yaroslav Lees, and I am going to tell you how it ended. Or rather, how it began to end, because things like this do not end simply or completely. They settle. They resolve the way a deep sound resolves, not by stopping but by changing into something you can carry. The signing ceremony was not grand. We did not hold it in the conclave chamber, which had been closed for formal session since our withdrawal. We held it in the main conference room of the Axis 7 administrative wing, which humanity now operated at a table that had room for 9 delegations and a translation array. The Vreth government sent Ambassador Vreth Kalen, the same being who had stood in the same facility weeks earlier, and described New Carthage as a corrective administrative action. He looked different now. Not defeated exactly. Diminished. As if the weeks had taken something from him that had not been visible before. A certain confidence in the shape of things, the assumption that he knew how the room worked and who held the weight in it. He signed on behalf of the Vreth Dominion. His hands were steady. I will give him that. I signed on behalf of humanity. My hands were steady too. The terms were not what the galaxy expected. Every analysis that had been made by conclave observers, by other species, watching the conflict, by the various intelligence services monitoring our communications, had predicted that humanity would claim territory. The analysis was logical. We had won. When civilizations win, they take territory. It is how galactic power works. It is how it has always worked. We did not take territory. Our terms were specific, and they were not about us. The first term, the Vreth Dominion would commit to the full reconstruction of New Carthage. Not a symbolic gesture. Not a fund administered by a third party. Vreth engineering crews, Vreth materials, Vreth labor working on the surface of that world under human supervision until the colony was whole. Again, this would take years. We were prepared to wait. The second term, the Vreth government would compile and publish a complete record of every person killed in the orbital action on New Carthage. Every name, every record they possessed. This record would be cross-referenced against human archives, and any discrepancies investigated. Monuments would be built on New Carthage itself, listing each name. The construction of those monuments would be part of the first term's requirements. The third term, the Vreth Dominion would participate in the formation of a new galactic framework to replace the conclave as the primary dispute resolution body. This framework would have real enforcement mechanisms, It would not be permitted to schedule. Hearing 8 months after a civilian population was destroyed. It would have a response mandate, measured in days, not months, and it would have member species with actual authority to act on that mandate, not just to observe and file paperwork. When the VRETH legal delegation had first seen the draft terms 3 weeks before the signing, their initial response had been that the reconstruction requirement was technically impossible, too large, too long, too uncertain in outcome. I had sat across from their legal team and said, very simply, the list of things that seemed impossible 6 months ago is already quite long. We suggest you begin revising your sense of what is possible. They revised it. Ambassador VRETH Kalin signed. The other delegations present signed as witnesses. I signed. Then the room was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet that follows a thing that has been building for a long time finally arriving at its conclusion. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt something that was closer to tired, the kind of tired that comes not from a single long day, but from years of carrying something heavy. Not grief exactly, though there was grief in it. Not relief exactly, though there was relief. Something compound and difficult to name. I thought about 2.3 million names. 3 days after the signing, I flew to New Carthage. It was the first time I had been to the surface since before the orbital action. The transport descended through an atmosphere that was still recovering. The air analysis said it would be clean within 2 years, possibly less. Below the ground was the particular color of aftermath. Not quite ruins, because there was not enough left standing to call ruins. More like the memory of a place. But there was already work happening. The first Wraith engineering teams had arrived the previous week, ahead of schedule. I think they wanted to demonstrate seriousness. There were also human engineers present, overseeing, and a small team from the Parath Federation who had offered technical support as part of their alignment discussions with us. The Arash had sent 4 structural specialists. I had not expected that. I do not think anyone had. I walked through the worksite for about 2 hours. The scale of what needed to be done was not comfortable to look at directly. You could see it better in sections. This area, that area, the grid of coordinates where homes had been, where the market district had operated, where the school complex had stood. The project team had divided it carefully, and they were starting with infrastructure the way you always start, because nothing else can follow without it. Near the eastern survey boundary, I saw Sergeant Priya Adami. I recognized her from the news aggregate photograph, the one of her back in the Wraith corridor, small against the alien darkness. In person, she was more ordinary looking than photographs suggested. She was standing at the edge of a survey stake with her hands in her jacket pockets, looking at a section of cleared ground where a building's foundation was being laid. Beside her was a young Wraith engineer. They were not talking. They were just standing there, both of them looking at the same thing, the way people stand when they're watching something being made, and there is nothing useful to say, and saying it would only get in the way. I watched them for a moment. Then I turned and walked in a different direction. That moment did not need an audience or a record. It was already what it was. Admiral Davian Osai held the fleet review 2 weeks after the armistice. 4,000 ships arranged not for display but for the practical purpose of status, assessment and reassignment. Most of them would remain deployed, not in breath space, not in any aggressive posture, positioned, present, in the lanes and the border regions and the places that mattered. I attended the review by remote link. From Axis 7, I watched Davian walk the line of senior officers and I listened to the speech he gave, which was short and which I will record here as accurately as I can. He said, "We were quiet for 300 years. We were in the room and we were patient. And we believed, because we wanted to believe it, that patience would eventually produce results. We were wrong about the last part. Patience produced nothing except more to be patient about. What produced results was the thing we built in the dark while we were being patient. Do not mistake that lesson. We do not dismantle what we built. We do not stand down because the current situation has resolved. We remain. We are here. And the galaxy now knows what it did not know before, which is that we have always been here and we were always going to be, and the only question that was ever open was how long before we stopped pretending otherwise. It was not a speech designed for history. He did not write it for recording. He was just talking to his officers at a fleet review, telling them something true. I wrote it down anyway. Old habit. The new framework took 4 months to draft. I was part of the drafting committee, along with representatives from the Parath Federation, the Kel Shirati, whose quiet presence in the process was, I think, more influential than the formal record shows, and 6 other species who joined as the process became clearer and the shape of the thing became visible. We did not call it a replacement for the conclave. The conclave still existed, technically. Some of its administrative functions were useful and we retained them. What we built alongside it was different in nature, where the conclave was a discussion forum with advisory authority. The new framework had a response mandate. Any military action against a civilian population required an immediate response from framework member states within 72 hours, not a response scheduled 8 months later, not a hearing, a response. The enforcement mechanism was the thing that had taken the most negotiation. It required member states to commit actual resources, ships, personnel, material to standing response capability. Some species objected. Some said it was too demanding. I sat across from one delegation that spent 3 sessions arguing that the 72-hour window was unrealistically fast. I said the Wraith took 4 hours to destroy New Carthage. We are asking for 72 hours to respond. I think that is a very generous window. They agreed to the 72 hours. The framework was named, in galactic standard, the Accord of Mutual Obligation. It was not a dramatic name. It described exactly what it was. You sign it, you are obligated. You violate it, the obligation runs the other way. Simple, clear, with teeth. The first session of the Accord was scheduled for 6 weeks after the armistice signing. I would be the human representative on the Standing Council. I had other staff now, younger people, competent and not shaped by 11 years of absorbing humiliation quietly. Leon Carter was one of them. He had asked to remain in diplomatic service rather than return to Earth and I had been glad he asked. He was careful and thorough, and he had a reason to care about this work that was written in a photograph on a wall in a small room on a space station. The night before the first session, I sat in my office on Axis 7 and went through my log files. All of them. 11 years of daily entries. The session reports, the procedural objections, the scheduling notices, the records of things said in rooms and written in documents and filed in queues. That went nowhere. I read some of them. Not all of them. There were too many. What I noticed, reading them after everything that had happened, was not the frustration in them, though the frustration was there if you knew how to read between the careful professional language. What I noticed was that I had never stopped. That is the thing about keeping records. You have to believe the record will eventually matter to someone, or there is no point in keeping it. I had believed it. Even in the worst sessions, even in the quietest and most pointless moments, I had kept writing because I had believed that what was happening was real and that real things deserved to be recorded. The record had mattered. I opened a new entry in the log. Not a report. Not a formal document. Just an entry. I wrote the first session of the Accord of Mutual Obligation convenes tomorrow morning. Human delegation at full staff. Framework includes 14 founding member species. The Vreth reconstruction of New Carthage is 6 weeks into a projected 4-year timeline. The Aresha have been formally recognized as an independent entity by the current Vreth government, which is a new government because the one that ordered the orbital action no longer exists in its previous form. Then I stopped and looked at what I had written. I added one more line. I wrote the first item on tomorrow's agenda submitted by the Torathi delegation, who were present when New Carthage was described as a corrective administrative action, and who did not. Object is a motion to formally apologize to the people of New Carthage and to their families. The motion has 14 co-signatories. It will pass unanimously. I know it will pass unanimously because I drafted it. I sent it to the Torathi delegation 3 weeks ago and asked them to submit it. I asked them specifically because they had been in the room. I asked them because being in the room and saying nothing is a kind of decision, and decisions have consequences, and the record shows both. They agreed to submit it without hesitation. The Torathi elder who responded to my message said only that they should have objected sooner. I wrote that down too. Tomorrow the session will begin. Tomorrow the agenda will proceed. Tomorrow 14 species will sit at a table with real obligations attached to their names and real consequences attached to their choices. It is not a perfect thing. Nothing built by many parties with conflicting histories is perfect. It will have problems. It will require continuous work. There will be sessions that go badly and decisions that need revisiting and moments when it seems like the whole structure is more fragile than it should be. But it has teeth. That is the thing that matters most. It has teeth, and the teeth exist because we built them, and we built them because we had been in enough rooms where the only option was to smile and accept and file a complaint that would reach the bottom of a queue and wait. We were done waiting. I closed the log. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their patient indifference. The navigation lights on Axis 7. Exterior framework blinked their slow. Rhythm, the same rhythm I had watched for 11 years from a different room on a different corridor when this was a conclave station and I was a level 4. Attaché with a cold cup of coffee and a filing queue that never ended. The station was ours now. Not conquered. Not seized. Operated. Managed. Tended to the way you tend to something you intend to use for a long time for a serious purpose. I thought about the word enough. How it had arrived in 12 words of military cipher at 3:40 station time and changed everything. How small it was. How ordinary. Enough. A word you use when you have reached the limit of something. When the measurement is complete. When the cup is full and cannot hold anything further. We had reached the limit. The cup had been full for a long time. We had simply, finally said so. And the galaxy had realized in the weeks and months that followed that this was not a beginning or an ending, but a correction, a recalibration. The moment when the actual weight of things became visible because we had stopped pretending it was something lighter. I did not become something greater. Through all of this, I do not think humanity did either, not in the way the stories like to frame it. We became something known, something seen clearly, for perhaps the first time by others who had been looking at us without really seeing what was there. A species that remembers, a species that keeps records, a species that helps a colony in an outer system because the signal is there, and the ships are nearby and someone decides we can do something about this. A species that, when you push far enough, past the patience in the filed complaints and the rescheduled hearings, and the careful diplomatic smile says one word and means it. The session begins at 800. I have my notes ready. The record continues.